Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects, a Fidelity Investments Canada podcast connecting you to the world of investing and helping you stay ahead. In this episode, we welcome special guest, Queen's University professor and Eisenhower Fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome, Christian Leuprecht. Christian joins us to dive into the geopolitical discussions at the upcoming G7 summit, focusing on foreign policy, economic growth, and geostrategic dynamics. Christian notes key agenda items such as enhancing security, prosperity, and democracy on the international front. He discusses topics such as the current relationship between Canada and the U.S. and what the upcoming election means from a macroeconomic perspective. He examines rising economic tensions such as China's relationship with Taiwan and the current supply chain disruptions in the Indo-Pacific region. He also talks about what the broader implications are for geopolitics, hybrid warfare, and economic integration with countries such as Russia and North Korea. This podcast was recorded on June 11th, 2024.
So let's start off with the G7 that's starting this week. Can you talk a bit about kind of what's on your radar? What are the topics? What's on the agenda that you're going to be watching for this week?
Well, I think there's three sort of perennial challenges, which is security, prosperity, and democracy. That is to say, how do we ensure that we preserve the regional and international stability that is essential for international trade and for prosperity? How do we enhance and grow the prosperity that we have? And how do we enhance and expand the values that we believe are fundamental for that prosperity, which is the fundamental democratic political values, freedom, equality, justice, and the like, that we all take for granted in the West, but that, as we have learned, and we are learning in hard ways, both internationally as well as in this country, democracy is not something to be taken for granted or taken lightly. Democracy ultimately needs to be defended and requires a strategy of how it is to be preserved because it is fragile.
Let's talk about the U.S. That is on everyone's mind. Elections are coming up. U.S. is our biggest trading partner. How do you see the relationship between U.S. and Canada, and where could it go, come November?
I think this is inherently the question that not just Canadians, but everyone around the world, of course, is asking. But there's a couple of sort of ways in which Canada is different from any one other country. So the first thing I would say is that, yes, we are all concerned about how the election might turn out. But ultimately, there's a continuity in U.S. foreign policy, which is unilateralism, not isolationism. That is to say, the United States, like any other country, will always act in the way that is in its own best interests. Only it has capabilities and resources to do that in ways that other countries or smaller powers, middle powers such as Canada, have much greater difficulty to do. And so what you get with a democratic Biden administration is unilateralism with a smile. What you get with a Trump administration is unilateralism with a frown. But ultimately, it is all about unilateralism. And so for Canada, the strategy on that has been twofold. One is, how can Canada shape and influence U.S. unilateralism, not just in Washington, but also with a significant presence among U.S. states? 38 U.S. states have Canada as their top trading partner. And so that gives Canada significant influence and leverage at the level of state capitals. And so Canada has quite intentionally built out that influence. And that is, of course, across both Democrat and Republican administrations in state capitals. The other element, of course, is that Canada tries to balance its interests, and it does so through close relationships with other allies and partners, in particular with European partners, and in particular with NATO, which gives Canada an opportunity to try to counteract the U.S. unilateralism under which Canadian sovereignty might otherwise buckle.
How would you characterize the relationship between Canada right now and the U.S.? Trudeau and Biden, and who knows what will happen next? But how would you characterize that relationship today?
So inherently, I think these are two administrations that sort of are more friendly with one another, just ideologically, but also in terms of personalities, than perhaps if we had a Trump or Republican administration. One of the ironies is that Canada often does better economically under Republican administrations than under Democratic administrations. And you might argue that that is the case today. Because if you look at economic growth, for instance, and the trajectories for economic growth in Canada, the United States, you look at the divergence of interest rates, there's sort of some indication that that this will cause inherently at least some economic strain in terms of the relationship between the two countries. The other key takeaway of this relationship is, regardless of who gets elected in November, President Biden is the last of what I call the transatlantic generation. So the people who grew up in the post-World War II era, who built the multilateral international system that has given rise to the international rules-based order that we live in. And so there is going to be a fundamental change in terms of U.S. orientation and how U.S. interests, both domestically and internationally, manifest. And I think we increasingly see a divergence of U.S. interests, geopolitical, strategic, but also economic interests from Canada and from other traditional allies. And so I think regardless, we need to get ready that the relationship with the United States in future will be that transaction costs are going to grow. It's just a matter whether those transaction costs are going to grow exponentially this November or November 4 years from now.
Moving just on to U.S. and China, obviously the two big economic powerhouses. Lots, that relationship, seems to have been fracturing with Trump and tariffs. In your view, I mean, what is the stance that the U.S. is taking towards China? Are things changing? How do you characterize that relationship today?
Yeah, one of the interesting continuities, right? So Trump was very much seen as a disruptor in many ways, as we know, but he was a key disruptor when it comes to America's relationship with China. And everybody was watching what the Biden administration was going to do. And of course, the Biden administration has largely pursued that trajectory of economic containment, of disruption. And the Biden administration has pursued a number of other sort of Trump policies. So that's sort of some indication that to some extent, U.S. national interest doesn't change regardless of who's ultimately in the White House. Necessarily, what the U.S. faces for the first time in decades is a geostrategic rival. That is to say, a country that, in terms of its political, economic, possibly also its military clout, can present, at least within the Indo-Pacific region, a real rival to U.S. and ultimately allied geostrategic, geopolitical interests. And so the U.S. on the one hand is trying to run a strategy of containment with regards to China's influence in the region and in the world. But on the other hand, the U.S. is trying to have constructive relations, because if you want to get something done with countries, especially with a country that's as economically, politically influential as China is, it's more helpful to keep talking than to find yourself in conflict.
Do you think are U.S. interests diverging from their, Western partners, or what do you hear? Are those Western partners, on board with how the U.S. is handling that relationship?
So I think that's a great question. I think it is a widely misunderstood point among allies and partners, in particular Canada and European partners, which is, for one thing, the United States, too, suffers from resource scarcity. That is to say, it only has so many tax dollars, it only has so large an economy, it only has so many military assets it can deploy. And from the US perspective, the game in the 21st century is clearly in the Indo-Pacific theater and clearly revolves around China. And so the message by the United States, when the United States says allies need to pay up in terms of their defense contributions, for instance, is that yes, the US is still there to help allies out when it comes to Europe, for instance, in particular the US Army, but that the US in many ways has bigger priorities. And so that allies need to grow up and they need to look after their own neighborhood. They need to look after their defense, security, intelligence obligations. And that's not just simply to keep their own country safe and secure and their own democracies and preserve their own prosperity, but rather to take responsibility for their region. That is to say, ultimately, the United States expects Canada to take responsibility for the Arctic and for Arctic security and Arctic sovereignty, because that is ultimately the greatest risk in terms of a threat to the continent from China and Russia, if you look at the trajectories by which missiles would fly to this continent. And similarly, for our European partners and allies, a clear message from the United States. You need to take responsibility for your neighborhood. You need to take responsibility also in terms of your southern flank, so relationships with the Mediterranean Rim countries, with the Sahara-Sahel, precisely so that the United States can focus its attention, its interests, its assets on the Indo-Pacific theater.
Do you think Canada is, how are they responding to the U.S. wanting them to take responsibility? Are we ready for our own defenses?
So again, I think that's a great question. And it is one of the reasons why, of course, there's lots of talk about what would happen to NATO if Trump were reelected. Well, it turns out that what Trump says on NATO and what Trump does on NATO are actually two quite different things. And that's because NATO is a very effective mechanism for the United States to try to coordinate now 31 other allies. Nowhere in the world, you might argue, does the United States invest as little in terms of its defense and security relationship as it does in Europe relative to the returns that it reaps. Look at the Indo-Pacific theater, defense, diplomacy. These are very complex operations because there is no one institution that can readily coordinate the allies and partners throughout the region. But this is also why it's so important to the United States that other allies, such as Canada, play ball. Because Canada, of course, being part of the G7, as a founding member of the G7, as a founding member of NATO, as an economy of a significant size, has the ability to make significant contributions. And look, Canada and Canadians like to think of themselves as a middle power. But if you actually look at Canada's economic capabilities, Canada is a fairly substantial, influential country. If you look at the list of countries globally and you look at sort of middle powers, where that runs, you would roughly get to number 56 on that list, which is Estonia. And so I think there's some concern from the United States that actually Canada has been underplaying its hand by saying, we're small, we're far away, there's not much we can do. And the United States looks at Canada and says, actually, you have a lot more responsibility than you are prepared or willing to take on. And as a prime minister, you're going to have to explain that to your electorate. And the problem is, of course, that Canadian governments don't want to explain that to their electorate because in this country, there's very few votes to be had in security, intelligence, and defense.
Just moving on to, or continuing on the Indo-Pacific region, what are some of the big issues or big events that you're paying attention to that could potentially change, the balance of power, or just kind of what we think about or how we deal with that region?
Well, the first, I think, element that we all need to pay attention to is supply chains. And we learned that the hard way. Initially, we got sort of a canary in the coal mine during SARS, but we learned it the hard way, of course, during the pandemic. And so that disruptions to supply chains from the Indo-Pacific theater in general and from China in particular have major ramifications for our economies. And so that has a number of implications. That is partially driving sort of the reshoring or the onshoring of some assets and some investments. It's also driving some of the security and the defense investments in the region. It's driving some of the greater autonomy also by countries within the region, realizing that you want to build in redundancy in terms of supply chains. So why would you put all your money into China? It might be of your interest to disperse your money sort of more broadly. But of course, the issue that everybody's watching, in the immediate term is China's relationship with Taiwan and what China might have up its sleeves. There are certainly concerns among especially allies in the region that on a timeline of somewhere between 3 to 8 years, you will see a conflict of one sort or another emerging between that China will essentially foist on Taiwan. My concern is that if the economy in China continues to deteriorate, that tends to present an incentive for regimes, in particular authoritarian regimes, to try to distract from their economic woes, and that might accelerate a conflict. But of course, we're also watching North Korea. North Korea has now become a nuclear weapons and essentially with exporting significant amounts of kinetic ammunitions to Russia. North Korea has now become an overt weapons proliferator, And when North Korea engages in weapons proliferation, that should be of significant concern for all of us who have an interest in regional and global stability.
Just on Taiwan and China, I mean, investors so, I mean, it's always uncertain, but is there, do you have a thought as to like when, I mean, how are these tensions unfolding? I know there's sort of different timelines that people think when things could get potentially worse. What are you kind of expecting?
So certainly China will be looking, if there is going to be a conflict, China will be looking for a weakness from the United States. And so countries such as China are only too happy to see the United States drawn into the conflict in Ukraine, drawn into the quagmire that is the Middle East, because it means that the US has to redirect political attention, military attention away from its main priority in terms of its geostrategic interests, which is China. So one of the challenges that we face is that both Russia and China have an interest in stirring up trouble in the rest of the world in order to keep the United States occupied in other parts of the world, which is part of the reason why the United States keeps on saying that allies and partners need to do more so that the United States doesn't always have to step in everywhere else and then get distracted from what ultimately needs to be our priority in terms of keeping eyes on the ball. The concern, of course, is that this potential conflict with Taiwan, my sense is that if China were to start a conflict, it likely wouldn't be an invasion or war. Invasions are very difficult, even when you have a very large military. Taiwan is not as easy to invade as people think. If you understand a little bit about the terrain in Taiwan and the straits. But what China can, of course, do, and what China has already demonstrated that it is able to do, is essentially to have a naval blockade and lay siege to Taiwan. And essentially then throwing the ball into the court of the United States to say, what are you going to do to bail Taiwan out?
You mentioned onshoring, and I just wanted to make sure we touch on that. It's been talked about for a while, but seems like, clearly since COVID, there's been more talk about this. How big of a movement is this onshoring? And I wonder how it might impact the relationship with other countries, given that typically when countries do business together, there's stability there because they need to work together.
Yes, there's two separate issues that we might unpack there. One is sort of what's sometimes known as the democratic peace theory, so that democracies don't tend to go to war with one another. And why don't they? Because they tend to have very profound interdependent relationships that provide significant incentives for them to double down on those relationships. And that's, of course, for instance, part of the genius behind sort of Robert Schuman and the European Union, try to get countries that have traditionally been at war with one another to try to become more intertwined in terms of their trade and political relationships. And look, that's worked very well in Europe. We've had almost 80 years of peace and stability in Europe that is effectively historically unprecedented. So the question is, how are we going to make sure that we can sustain that and we can perpetuate that? So there is an interest in tying countries together. The problem is there's about 57 countries in the world that believe in this approach. That is to say, what we sometimes refer to as the liberal international rules-based order. And the rest of the countries are either sitting on the fence or are actively hostile to it, such as, in particular, China, but also countries such as Russia, North Korea, and Iran, as you well know. And so we need to kind of be clear about the fact that there are countries that are actively working to undermine the system, and that in many cases are not just a revisionist, such as Russia, but ultimately want to overturn the order that we have, which they believe is not working in their geostrategic interests. And to that effect, they have an interest in undermining our democratic values and our economic systems. This is often what's known as hybrid warfare, gray zone tactics. And look, why would you attack North America or countries such as Canada when you can deliberately undermine our political institutions, our democratic processes, our economy, polarize our society, and divide us from the inside? And so we need to understand that the manifestations that we're seeing in the media on a daily basis, whether it's polarization, whether it's foreign interference, these are not by accident. These are deliberate strategies by adversaries to try to divide us. And so the opportunity for us to double down on integration, in particular on economic integration, and in particular on the North American continent. But that ultimately depends on us working effectively across borders, because our comparative advantage in North America among Canada, the United States, and Mexico is the rapid movement of goods and what we produce across our borders. If it is held up, then ultimately we lose our comparative advantage to other places in the world. So onshoring ultimately depends on making sure we can make our borders work and manage them well and effectively.
Any comments on the European parliamentary elections? Any geopolitical impact there?
So the European Parliament has been gaining in political importance. Many of the key sovereign decision-making elements still lie with European states. But of course, it is a bellwether for where public opinion is going within Europe. Now, voters might be willing to take greater risks in casting their vote for the European Parliament because they know the implications are less than they would be at the national level. But it is certainly an indication that there is change afoot, that voters are frustrated, that a significant portion of voters in Europe is frustrated about issues similar to those that we have here, related to cost of living, related to policies, whether rightly or wrongly, that they believe are driving up their cost of living, in particular their energy costs. And they're also concerned about issues such as migration. I mean, this should come as no surprise. We'll have 2.5 billion more people in the world over the next 25 years. Most of them are being born in countries that are already today politically, economically, socially not particularly stable, and that are affected disproportionately by climate change. So I think we want to think long and hard about how do we, on the one hand, we live in a democracy where we need to be tolerant even of those political views that we might find objectionable, provided that they're acceptable within a democratic framework. On the other hand, it suggests that our democratic institutions are coming under increasing strain to govern ourselves effectively in a way that serves the views of the electorate. And you can see that in terms of polarization and frustration, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, or among also a growing portion of the Canadian electorate.
Another question, any comments on Canada's Arctic sovereignty? You touched on it a little bit, but are Western partners helping? Where are you at with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I recently did a book on this, Polar Cousins, Antarctic and Arctic Comparative Geostrategic Futures. So I think we need to look at the Arctic and the Antarctic as geostrategic as poles. Change in the Arctic and Antarctic environments is happening at exponential rates, much greater than we see it in the rest of the planet in terms of climate change, and that is having significant geostrategic ramifications. But look, from a Canadian perspective, if you talk to people in the North and you ask them about what their security priority is, they will likely tell you that their priority is food security. So how we think about the Arctic is also heavily dependent on where we ultimately live and reside. So what is our strategy in this country to shore up the resilience of our northern communities? And when we talk about Arctic security, what a lot of people, I think, have a hard time understanding is when we started with nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles in the 1950s, and we stood up the North American Aerospace Defense Command in 1957, Canada was a flyover country, right? So the missiles would fly over Canada, they would hit somewhere in the United States. And so Canada had an important role to play in defending the continent, but ultimately this was a US game. But now, of course, given how interdependent we are, look at our electricity grid, look at our transportation systems, for instance, missiles don't have to hit the United States in order to have a massive disruptive consequence for the continent. And so Canada needs to understand that it is now also on the front line of the hypersonic and other weapon systems that adversarial states are actively developing and in some cases already have in service, and that some of these are quite difficult to defend against. And so Canada has an obligation to ensure its primary obligation needs to be, if we talk about Canadian sovereignty, it is ultimately about continental defense and continental sovereignty. And that means holding these adversaries at bay, because any adversary that can threaten our sovereignty, in particular US sovereignty, can ultimately undermine our ability to make our own sovereign, independent foreign policy decisions, because now an adversary that is displeased with the decision coming out of Ottawa or Washington might say, well, if you don't reverse that decision, we might just lob a missile over your way in order to influence your decision making. And so keeping the continent safe is Canada's most important contribution to international stability, because keeping North America safe allows the United States to provide extended deterrence to allies and partners across the world, and in particular, extended nuclear deterrence.
That would be something if we started getting missiles up in the north. That would change the game for sure for Canada. What about? I want to talk about Ukraine. We only have about 4 minutes left, so just where are we at with Ukraine and Russia? Are the G7 partners committed to a sustained war there?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. Look, ultimately, the geostrategic ramifications of sending a message that the sort of behavior in which Putin has been engaging ultimately leads to political success would be horrendous, because it would embolden any authoritarian, dictatorial regime that all they need to do is run the world with violence and show up with large weapons and be able to sustain that, and they'll ultimately get their political way. And of course, I think we've all agreed, especially since the calamities of World War I and II, that we don't want a world where coercion and violence ultimately wins the day in terms of how you assert your political, economic, and geostrategic interests. The challenge is, of course, that our countries, such as Canada and European allies, prepare to stay the course. We've seen, I think, one of the silver linings of the delay in provision of military supplies to Ukraine by the United States has been that European allies have come together much more in terms of the support that they can provide. But it's also shown that only the United States is ultimately able to provide the military backing and the military support. And so that reinforces the point that I've long made, that the United States remains not just the leader of the free world, but the undisputed leader of the world per se, and that the decisions that are made in Washington are ultimately consequential for political stability, for prosperity, and for the security of our allies and of the world more broadly.
Just quickly, what are some of the geopolitical topics that should be on the minds of investors and the C-suites? Some things we didn't talk about, it's like cybersecurity, which seems to be becoming a big part of the conversation here. What are some of those things that investors should keep top of mind?
So there's been two key trajectories that for prosperity over the last 30 years in terms of the immense growth that we've seen in prosperity. And one has been free trade, and the other, globalization, and the other has been the internet. And as both of those sort of kind of come to see sort of some curtailment, that is ultimately going to have an impact on economic growth potential in the future. And so some of that might be made up by AI and developments in AI. So I'd be watching that carefully, but I'd also be paying attention to what's happening in the C-suite in terms of corporate security, including cybersecurity, because increasingly reputational risk and financial risk for corporations will be closely tied to their ability to weather disruptions, whether it is kinetic disruptions or disruptions in cyberspace and the digital space.
Christian, I feel like we've only barely scratched the surface here of the issues that we could be talking about. But fortunately, those who are listening in can get more insights from Christian's recent publications. His book, Security, Cooperation, and Governance, The Canada-US Open Border Paradox, and Dirty Money, Financial Crime in Canada. So pick those up, and hopefully we will talk again soon. Thank you for being here.
Been a real pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/how-to-buy for more information. While visiting fidelity.ca, you can also find information on future live webcasts. And don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thanks again. See you next time. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada, ULC, or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy or endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or security cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated.